Hola, voy a hablar en inglés. Hace 47 años que no he estudiado español o castellano y tal vez es mejor para ustedes y para mí también que hablo en inglés. So let me just set my timer because I can talk all day about all this stuff. So what can I do here? In any case, I'm Toomas Ilves, and I'm going to talk about how my country digitized, and it's something I've been talking about for a long time. I will talk about blockchain as part of the component, one of the components of a digital country. And I'm glad to be in Catalonia, which is the digitally most advanced country south of mine. So, just so you have an idea, we're a small country. Basically, everyone has an ID card. Just about everyone uses the internet. This is all in stark contrast to where we were several years ago.
Running a modern...
No. And we, through digitization, we calculate based on time saved by citizens and by the government that we save about 2% of GDP a year, which I say pays for our NATO contribution. The usage of internet voting, that's an old statistic. It is now 46% of the population votes online. Doesn't matter. What's interesting also, I guess, is 0.3% of the population that's involved in IT produces 7% of GDP. More interesting, what I am proud of, we're number one in the European Commission's survey of digital services and governance. This is old again, we once again are number one in the world for internet freedom. But also, we are, according to the UN, number one in Europe for security. And this is important to me personally, since because for me, I'm very much a believer in freedom, digital freedom. And you will hear from various authoritarian states that in order to have security, you have to cut down on freedom. Well, that's not true, and we prove it. So, what I will talk about is what we have done and how we got there. What is important to think about is that, in fact, the digitization of government services allows us to redo the way government has been done since the beginning. Where am I going here? All right. What we first of all have noticed is that the private sector has advanced in amazing ways in the past 10, 15 years. All kinds of services. I live right now in Silicon Valley, and in a 12-kilometer radius of where I live are the headquarters of Tesla, Apple, Google, Facebook, Palantir, and who knows how many other unicorns or billion-dollar companies. At the same time, if I want to go to get a driver's license, it can take me 3 years. In order to register my daughter to go to school, I had to bring a photocopy of my electricity bill. So the mecca of IT for the world has the most primitive public services that you can imagine. Now, much of it has to do with bureaucracy. Bureaucracy was invented either in China, they appeared more or less at the same time in 3 places: Mesopotamia, China, and Egypt. And this really goes along with the creation of a state, because if you're a ruler, you need to know how many sheep you have, how many people you have, how much they're paying in taxes. And this is a 2,000-year-old picture of bureaucrats writing on paper in China. nature of bureaucracy has been, until the last 25 years, in potential, and in reality it continues in almost every country, is that bureaucracy is a serial process. You go see the government, you fill out a form, someone stamps it, sends it to the next agency, they go look and through the files, look at it, see if it's okay, they put a stamp, it can go to another agency and a fourth agency and a 17th agency. What we have done discovered and implemented in our country is that we can bring in parallel processing to governance, which means that everything happens all at once. And so, for example, if I want to register a business, in order to register a business, my government requires all kinds of checks. You know, have you paid your taxes? Have you committed a crime? Have you gone bankrupt? All these things. Now, in the old way, for example, in Italy, a couple of years ago, it would take 18 months to get a business license, because every one of those things had to be checked, and it was in serial fashion, and it took a while because it was all on paper. In Estonia, it takes 15 minutes to set up a business because all of those checks are done simultaneously in parallel, and it's a binary decision. Yes, no. Have you committed a crime? No. Back. You can open it. Have you paid your alimony? All of those decisions are made in parallel and automatically. I will also the other thing that digitization is fantastic for is reduction of corruption. There are two basic kinds of corruption. There's grand corruption, and this is what you read about in the newspapers. Yeah, a minister took so much money to give a contract to somebody or something on that order. And that is important to note, is you're paying a minister to do, or a public official, you pay him money to do something illegal. But there's another kind of corruption, the kind of corruption which actually is all over the world in poorer countries, sometimes in richer ones too, and that is petty corruption or opportunistic corruption, where you're a citizen. In order to get a basic service, you have to pay extra money to the civil service. In Greece, it's called speed-up cash, or it's also called, interesting enough, fakilaki, which is small envelope in Greek. Because you have to give a small envelope. But I've discovered this, or I have been talked to about all over the world. So basically what I'm going to talk about is how to digitize to get there. But the main point I want to make is that this has very little to do with technology. And the principles that I will talk about, in fact, right now we do not use SSI, or self-sovereign identity, because in our opinion it's not there yet, but it will be the direction that we go into. But basically it comes down to political will. If you see a country that is digitized, it is digitized because it has had the political will. Catalonia is a perfect example of a country that actually has had this. There are most of the countries in the European Union, for one reason or another, fear to do certain things, which I'll mention. So basically you pass a law, you need to have the political will to do it, and then you develop the policies of what you have to do, and then you have to pass laws that enable you to do all these things, and then you do the regulations. So what you need here is, most importantly, to digitize, you need a secure identity. And this is the biggest stumbling block, because countries don't know what that means, they're afraid to do it. To be secure, you need, at this point, at least, you need to use PKI, or rather, you need to have two-factor authentication, which is about the only secure way of doing things. You need to have end-to-end encryption. Self-sovereign identity will solve the PKI issue, I think, I hope. What is extremely important is the ability to sign legal documents with your identity, which is something that now is moving in Europe, but when we came up with it, it was brand new in the year 2000. No one even understood what it was, and nonetheless, it doesn't really work outside the EU. If you really want to digitize, you also want to make sure that you have a strong private sector participation in this. You need a secure architecture that allows you to do all the things that you need to do to run a government. And finally, and this is where the blockchain comes in, you must be able to guarantee data integrity. What we did, we used existing standards on how to, on our government platform. It is completely open source, non-proprietary. As I mentioned, very strong private sector participation. We set up the infrastructure almost 20 years ago, and all new services, public or private, are based on this same model, so it's easy to set up. And as I will mention later on, it has been taken over and copied to one degree or another, by 15 countries. In fact, we have more or less been eaten up by the Finns, because the Finns adopted our program, like it so much, and since there are 5 times as many Finns as there are Estonians, that means they are doing the bulk of the innovation today on the open source program. But the Finns will run throughout this. Why did we do this? Why did Estonia, which became independent in 1991 after 50-odd years of Soviet occupation, was that we were extremely poor. And then we had the Finns across the way. Finland and Estonia are, I guess, it's kind of linguistically, it's like Spanish and Portuguese. The Portuguese all understand Spanish. We Estonians all understand Finnish. The Spanish don't bother with Portuguese, and the Finns don't bother with us. But anyway, in 1938, we had the same GDP per capita. 1990, which was the last full year before the war. 1992, the first full year of independence or re-independence, there was an 8-fold difference in GDP per capita, which shows you the benefits of communism. And so various people saying, well, what do we do? And for me, since I learned to program 50 years ago, in this one-off bizarre program I was in, I looked at Finland, and this is what Finland had. This is what we had. And only 1/3 of the population had even this. So that was the level of development we were in 1992. And then we had these big questions. What do we do? And all kinds of people had all kinds of ideas. Oh, let's stay with the Soviet model and keep the kolkhozes. Other people wanted to become Hong Kong. There were all kinds of ideas. But for me, being a geek, in 1993, Mosaic came out. And this was 4 years after the HTTP protocol was invented by Tim Berners-Lee, but there had been no use for HTTP really until the first web browser, which you had to, in 1993, you had to go to the store and you had to buy it on floppy disks, which I did, and I thought this is great. And what really struck me was that whereas everything else, the West, as it were, was far, far ahead of us because they'd had 50 years of development, we had not. But here was something we were on exactly the same level playing field. We're all starting at the same point. So I pushed the government and pushed the government. I was a diplomat at the time, to get involved with digitization, and fortunately they listened. And one of the things that I pushed for, because I had learned to code in 1969, was that we should computerize all the schools and connect them up, which for at least a year I was the bête noire, the primary enemy of the teachers' union newspaper that attacked me every week for being the stupidest person ever. But in any case, we started a program to digitize or computerize the schools. Unfortunately, we had a minister of education who had a PhD in astrophysics, so he sort of understood the issue, and the government did it and listened to me. And so by 1998, all Estonian schools had computer labs, and they were all connected on the web. 1998 was a pretty early time to do that. It was so successful that the banks looked at this and said, wow, this is a pretty good idea. We should support this. And so we came up with another program that was basically funded by the banks, because our problem was we had all these little villages, and we had 3 big banks and then a bunch of other smaller ones. But every village had to have at least 2 banks in it. That's just the way they operate, a brick and mortar bank. But anything that has a small village, it just costs a lot of money in labor and in rent. So we pushed through a program called See the World, or Look at the World, in which we taught people, in the rural people, older people in the countryside, how to use computers. Every municipal sort of town hall had installed computers that people would use. This is all back when there was a very low computer ownership. Right now it's 90%, so it's not so relevant, but at the time, this is how we got the population on board. But the problem we faced was that it was not enough. Because, and this, since we've already had 2 talks on SSI, I don't have to go into this for you all, but this is the fundamental problem of the internet era, which is from this cartoon, which is 26 years old already, but this is the problem, is that who are you on the internet? And now if you want to digitize government, this becomes very important. This is not going onto Twitter with a Twitter handle. We have to know you are you. And so we came up with this. We sort of figured out we really need to develop a strong identity with all of these factors. Now, 2FA, two-factor authentication, was at the time and continues to be, until we come up with something better, the best way to identify yourself. And as I mentioned earlier, we are looking at SSI very seriously, but it's not there yet. And we need end-to-end encryption. And one thing that again comes up with the political will part is that identities will not, the digitization will not work unless you make a digital identity mandatory. And this is where government's saying, I don't want to do that. Well, the problem is that if you don't make it mandatory, basically what happens is about 25% of the population, the early adopters, will say, oh, this is cool, I'm going to get it. So, well, basically in Europe it runs, where it's voluntary, is 15 to 25%. Yeah, I've had an Apple since 1983, so, I'm an early adopter. I would have gotten this anyway. But the problem is, if you do not have mandatory universal IDs, what will then happen is that if you are a government or a private company that you would potentially use this system, is that you go like 75% of the population, 80% of the population doesn't have it. Why should I invest in developing a digital service when 3/4 of the population isn't or cannot use this? And so the first tough thing to do for a government is say, okay, all of you now you will all get a digital identity. And then you have to hope that the quality of the service will make them all use it. But in any case, it must be mandatory. And we see the failures in Europe, in the European countries that do not have mandatory identities. That's precisely why digital services never take off. Because people don't bother, and then there's no investment. Then if you look across Europe, you see where digitization of government services has not worked. It's precisely in those countries where you don't require it. So the steps, 2000, we passed the digital signature law, the first one of any in any country. Now everyone has one, I guess, in Europe at least. And it is the basis of all digital transactions, of contracts, and so on that we use, digital prescriptions. The use of it became really apparent to me when 2 years ago I was in Asuncion, Paraguay, and I had forgotten to sign a loan agreement, and I got an email saying, if you don't sign it by tomorrow, no loan. And so all I did was I just plugged my ID into my computer and I digitally signed it. If in the old days I would have had to wait for 2-3 days for Federal Express to send me a contract for a wet signature and then I'd send it back. These are the kind of advantage you get. So we rolled out this ID card. I don't really have to tell you about this stuff here because you know all about it. I mean, the next step 2 years later was someone had the bright idea that, well, actually, everyone has a chip in their phone, so why don't we just create a mobile ID, which we did, so you can do all the same things that you can do on the computer on your phone, except for people like me who at my age is very hard to read the small screen, so I use a computer. I don't have to tell you about end-to-end encryption, but the authentication is done in your device, so that so the authentication center that then decides what information you can have access to. All it gets is a message saying you are authenticated. It is important to note that two-factor authentication schemes must be genuinely end-to-end encrypted. A number of banks and institutions use 2FA over SMS. The S7 protocol used by transmission towers has long ago been hacked. And in fact, several years ago already, a German bank lost 3 million euros because they did their two-factor authentication over SMS. SMS 2FA is not reliable, don't use it. Two-factor authentication, I don't have to explain for this crowd probably, but anyway, you know something, and that may be a number, a password, or maybe something else, and something you have, and those two have to match, and what you have is a chip. So this is how we sign a document in my country. It's very boring looking, but you can do it digitally, and we have many hundreds of millions of digital signatures a year done this way. Every bank transaction, in the United States they still use paper checks, that in fact even if you bank digitally, what they do is it prints out a check that is then mailed. In the year 2019, but in any case, this is how you sign documents. Now, the next thing is you have, and this is our own innovation, which is you have to think seriously about architecture. Who can see what? And this is where regulation, laws, your culture of privacy, your culture of transparency, all come together which you have to take into account for your architecture. And this is when I say, it sort of makes sense when you say attitudes towards sort of your laws, fine, but take transparency. In Sweden and Finland, those countries actually publish everybody's income taxes publicly. Now that probably in most places would not go. So in Finland you would have one set of rules, and in another country you would have another set of rules. And so what you can access digitally, therefore, is a function of your cultural assumptions. Or another example, my country, our commissioner in the European Commission pushed through a regulation that said that CAP recipients must be public. Our position is all public monies must be known to the public money spent must be known to the public. And 40% of basically a €1 trillion budget over 7 years goes to CAP, the Common Agricultural Program. And then this was taken to court by a number of countries, including Spain, France, Italy, and Germany, saying, no, this is private. So our position was transparency, and that was Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, UK. Southern Europe said, no, 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 this is privacy. And then the European Court of Justice decided, okay, you can voluntarily publish. So my country publishes who gets how much cap money. France, Spain, Germany, Italy don't. But that's a cultural difference, and you have to take all of these things into account. So how does this work? We have a distributed data exchange layer. Everybody, I mean, the way it worked, and this is not because we were so brilliant, but because we had all these IT departments and all the ministries that didn't want to give up their data banks. So they said, no, no, we're never going to have a central database. We said, fine, but you can only connect to your own data, even you yourself, via our system. So you have to, so basically, we didn't have to build a big data center. Everyone kept their servers, but you couldn't get into the servers unless you identified yourself, and you were therefore, we knew who was looking at what. And so this is why it's a distributed data exchange layer. We also have very complex rules that, again, you have to figure out yourself for each country about who can see what. In my country, you can see what property I own, but you can't see my health records, right? And we have an additional factors that every person in Estonia can see who accesses your data. So when I was president, once a month, my PR guy would come and say, well, this newspaper and this newspaper and this magazine all queried your property records. Because they want to see, did he, God forbid, he might be buying things or something, we have this culture of envy in my country. So I would know that, this reporter from this newspaper was looking at my property records on this day. Works pretty well. All right. The idea of a distributed data exchange system, I just put this up here because you may remember about 20 years ago, the world's largest oil tanker, the Exxon Valdez, ran aground in Alaska, and it was the biggest oil spill ever. And the problem was that it was all one big hole. So if you hit a rock, then everything goes out. And after that, they've gotten a little smarter. And now, if you're an oil tanker, they're all compartmentalized. This is the security element of a distributed data exchange layer, is that if someone actually does manage to break into something, well, you can't really get everything. Now, I will now show you how this thing works. Hit it.
Running a modern state is a data-centered endeavor. Ensuring the functioning of the state requires administering very large quantities of data. Estonia lacks a centralized or master database. Data is stored where it is created. Each agency administers its own data separately, and data is not duplicated. At the same time, state authorities and agencies need data outside their purviews in order to function. For example, the police constantly require information from the population register. Likewise, the unemployment insurance fund depends on information from the health information system. How can authorities securely exchange important data? First, the data must be easily accessible by the authorities that are authorized to use it. Second, the integrity of the data must be maintained. No third party should be able to make any changes to the data while it is in transit. Third, the data must remain confidential during its journey. It must be protected from the eyes of unauthorized parties. The X-Road is a data exchange platform that fulfills all three of these requirements. The X-Road makes life simpler for both the state and the citizens. For example, when a child is born, information about the birth is sent directly from the hospital to the population register. From there, it is sent automatically to the health insurance fund, so that the child will have health insurance and a family physician. This prevents the creation of excessive paperwork and saves time. The state functions in the background. The X-Road helps authorities make work processes more convenient. Many activities can be automated, which frees employees to deal with matters that require human involvement. Authorities also don't have to worry about the authenticity of data. they can be confident that data received from the tax board definitely originated from the actual tax board. Additionally, the X-Road can be used regardless of what technology an authority uses. For the state, the X-Road, above all, makes it possible for authorities to efficiently exchange data among themselves. Sensitive information moves securely, and the system itself is so resilient that it cannot be easily brought down by those with malicious intentions. Since the birth of X-Road in 2001, the system has operated continuously without interruption. The X-Road helps the state see the big picture of how different authorities are connected to one another. In addition, the X-Road makes it possible to exchange data not only within the country, but also across national borders. That is, of course, if databases and information systems are working properly. The biggest beneficiaries of the X-Road are, of course, the citizens. They enjoy the benefits of a better functioning state and save all of the time they would otherwise spend submitting papers and forms. How much time? During the time it took you to watch this animation, the X-Road saved around 240 working hours in Estonia. Cool.
Now, when I talked about parallel processing from the government side, this also applies to the citizen. If a child is born, in the old days, you had to do all kinds of things. You had to get a birth certificate. You had to register the child for health care. You had to go register a child for a doctor. You don't want this anymore.
Organizations nowadays contain a lot of data, a lot of systems.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Huh? Today, what happens in Estonia is that as soon as a child is born, the hospital asks you what's his or her name. They inform then the central registry. From that point, all of the other processes, the health care, and we have, municipalities send you presents and diapers when you get, your municipality is notified that this child named this is born. All of those things happen automatically. You don't have to go through all of the procedures that you normally had to do in my country. Now this map shows where we are now currently, or this X-Road is currently being used, or in the process of being adapted. The biggest one, of course, is Finland, but the Faroe Islands, Iceland have it. Moldova took it. The most interesting case is Mexico, which is a federal country, and this is much more complex because there's small countries that have used this, and they are unitary states, so there's one level. Now, if you go to a federal government, you need to do this at different levels, what is part of the state, what is part of at the federal level. But to show you how it's all political, the CIO of Mexico, who was doing this for 5 years, I saw her the day before the new president came in, and I said, so what's going to happen? And she said, I have no idea. At 5 o'clock, I close my door, and I will have nothing to do with this anymore. So you need to, it does have a strong political component now. There. I talked about corruption. I won't go into that. Very important for citizen convenience and why they love our system is the once-only rule. Now, since you already have an identity that can be connected to all the various databases, we have a regulation in my country that the government may not ask you any information it already has. So, if I fill anything out digitally, I do not have to put my phone number, I do not have to put my address, when I fill my taxes, it's all there. You have this many kids who are eligible as dependents. I remember one year it was filled out for me and my older son was no longer there. I go, where's my son? And then I realized, wait a minute, he's 18 now. So, of course, he's no longer a dependent. And so this is something that, again, people love, and if you've lived in a country with a lot of bureaucracy, like I live in the United States temporarily, and believe me, all you do is fill out the same information all the time. Okay, finally, this is the blockchain part. And especially in Europe, is GDPR. Europeans are obsessed with privacy. And so are Americans these days as well, fortunately. And it's a completely reasonable thing to be obsessed with. You don't want people having access to your data. But I maintain that far more, I mean, privacy is a kind of a psychological thing, Do you want, you may not like it if someone publishes your blood type, right? I mean, maybe not, maybe you don't care, or someone publishes your bank account. In the digital era, what becomes a real issue is someone changing your data. That is also known as data integrity. And once you get to the point of complete digitization, which Estonia has been in for about 15 years, we essentially do not have paper records anymore. That includes publishing laws. We do not publish laws in big fat law books, it's just online. Court cases are not published. And so the question comes up, what happens if someone goes in there and changes your law as it was passed? Or there's a court case which was decided in 2009 that things will go this way. What happens if someone goes back and gets into the law case and changes it? And this is our big worry, and this should be the worry of all countries that digitize, is that you must maintain data integrity. So since 2008, we have put all critical data on blockchain. And so be it healthcare records, be it property records, court cases, those have all been on blockchain. As far as I know, it is by many years the first country to actually use blockchain to maintain data integrity of national records. And what have we done since we started this in 2001? We have e-voting, e-prescriptions. That's no big deal, though there is a big deal associated I'll talk about. We have e-residency, which someone has talked about, since one of the big realizations was that as long as you lived in a paper world, in the old days, the government needed to know who you are on paper so you could set up a business basically if you were a resident in the country. And one day I realized, well, actually, in this era, you don't have to be a resident. We just have to know who you are. And so we set up this e-residency. There are 50,000 people who have adopted Estonian residency. It doesn't give you any social or political rights, but it gives you the right of establishment, which has been used extensively by countries that want to, outside the EU, citizens of countries outside the EU that want to do business inside the EU. And so for all kinds of countries outside the EU, people applied for it. For example, in Ukraine, PayPal didn't work. It does in Estonia. And so Ukrainian software companies set themselves up in Estonia so they could be paid. SMEs in the UK have been the new trend. If you're a big UK company, obviously you already have a big, you have a building in Brussels or Paris or Berlin or Den Haag or Amsterdam. But if you're an SME, you don't have a building in any of those countries, but you don't want to, you want to be established inside the EU. So we see this huge sort of avalanche of applications from SMEs in the UK because they know as of a week from today they will be outside the EU and they want to be able to run in the European Union. And then I'll get to data embassies, which this is how we vote. Well, prescriptions, I mentioned prescriptions. It's not, I mean, everyone has digital prescriptions almost these days, even the United States, though they're kind of corporate linked. But we've had them since 2005, 2006. But it struck me after the Finns took over our data exchange layer that we should make this interoperable. Basically, we get 8 million Finns visiting Estonia across the Gulf of Finland every year, and there only are 5 million Finns. So they're always there for a good time. And what I did 10 years ago, I proposed, or 8 years ago, I proposed to the President of Finland that since we have the same system, they're interoperable, why don't we make prescriptions interoperable so a Finn comes to Estonia and has a good time and loses medicine, he can just get his doctor to put it into the system to pick a new one or get. And the technical part of this would probably take 2-3 weeks at most to set up, but it took almost 8 years. And the reason it took almost 8 years is proof of why digitization is a political process. Because the goal was to avoid arbitrage, that different countries have different rules for subsidizing different medicines for different age groups to a different degree. And so we had to harmonize Finnish and Estonian subsidies and for whom, so that no one would be using arbitrage to buy cheap or medicine more cheaply by coming to Estonia or vice versa. And that took 7 years, all of that. So this is, again, an example of why it's political. It's a political process, not a technological one. The technology is a no-brainer. And finally, something on data embassies, which is, I talked to your digital minister yesterday about this. You may want one for another reason than us, but in any case, this is the Fukushima tsunami. Now, it's either due to the wave of the tsunami or due to the meltdown of the reactor there. I don't know which one, but Japan lost a small amount of their national data. So we looked at this, and from our point of view in Estonia, we basically, over the last 1,000 years, have been invaded on an average of twice a century. And the 20th century was really bad because we were invaded 6 times. So we said, what happens? We're so digital. What happens if we get invaded again? And so what we did was, I call it the Assange rule, but the Vienna Convention on diplomatic representations gives extraterritoriality to embassies, which means the government where the embassy is cannot go into it. So we talked to the Luxembourgians, or the Luxembourgeois, and asked them, how about if we declare a server Estonian territory? And they said, okay. And so what we have is online, real-time, constant transfer via a dedicated line from Estonia of all critical databases. So in case we get invaded again, which is, with Donald Trump as president, you never know. And so we would have all records, who's a citizen, what they own, and so forth, available to us. So that's, these are all the data that we put onto, that are constantly updated 24/7. So anyway, that's kind of an overview of what we do. I don't know if there's time. Any questions? Questions? Oh, you're saying I'm done. I'm done. Okay, yeah, I probably went over anyway. I didn't set my clocks, but anyway.